Now, it is my honor to introduce our last speaker for today, Victor Piercey. Victor is a professor in the mathematics department and the director of general education at Ferris State University in Big Rapids, Michigan. He leads an interdisciplinary team in the development of a quantitative reasoning course integrating social justice, health, and business with mathematics. Currently, Victor is working on integrating ethics with mathematics, serves as a co-director of QSIDE's JUSTFAIR lab, and serves as a co-organizer of ICERM's data science and social justice program. He's also very active in the MAA and received his Ph.D. in mathematics from the University of Arizona in 2012. Thank you so much for being here, Victor. Please take it away.
Thank you for having me. Give me a moment while I do my thing here. All right, that was easy. All right, so hello, I'm going to speak with you about another QSIDE initiative called JUSTFAIR. A little background. The project we're working on derives from another project QSIDE engaged in that Chad and Jude led called JUSTFAIR, where they were looking at criminal sentences in federal sentences, criminal sentences in the federal criminal justice system. What we're doing is we are looking at the same thing at the state level. So a little bit about what JUSTFAIR is. The idea is we're looking for the presence and sources of sentencing bias, primarily by race or ethnicity. So when I mentioned that Chad and Jude led a team that looked into the same thing at the federal level, they've were able to publish multiple, at least 2 papers, I think, by now. And they have, they were able to disaggregate by judge. And several of the judges actually reached out to them and thanked them because they didn't know. And that's I think powerful work. So now we're looking at what we can do at the state level. I want to also mention that I said it says co-director, right? The lab co-director. My other co-director, my partner here is Dan Avery, who's Dan Alvey, who's not presenting with me, but he's with me in spirit. Dan and I have been co-leading this lab for a few months now. And there have been some folks who've come in and chatted with us for a little while, and there have been some folks who've really stuck with us. So let me tell you a little bit about what states we're looking at. So these aren't the only states, but these are the ones that have had most prominent participation in our conversations. So Minnesota, I'm going to come back to Minnesota in a minute. Minnesota is kind of like our toy example, so to speak. Illinois, although they haven't met with us, they've been having separate conversations, but they're doing a lot of that group. There's a group at Northwestern University doing a lot of work there. There's some folks from Michigan State University working in Michigan, and there's a person out in Montana, a graduate student working on data from Montana. One of the challenges we've run up against quite a bit is actually getting the data. In particular, in Michigan, there were a lot of they're still struggling to get data. They've tried FOIA requests. There are some things online, but they're resistant to web scraping. So there's a lot of issues there. And now Dan and I neither of us have a background in data science, but we're both excited about it and we're learning. So it's really a lot of fun. I can't remember Dan's background. My dissertation work was in algebraic geometry, so very far. Although at the same time as we're learning, it can be very near, at least the topology, some of the topological things. So we're learning as they're learning. So we haven't necessarily had the best advice for those having trouble getting data, but we're hoping to keep working on it. That was a real struggle at the federal level, by the way, that Chad and his team had, getting their hands on the data. However, Minnesota has a wonderful data set that's very thorough. So the idea is we are trying to use this as an example to develop a methodology for once you have the data. Now, getting the data is still of concern, but we haven't made much progress on that front. But once you have the data, what can you do with it to seek out and identify if there's sentencing bias, and if so, where is it coming from? Right? That's our goal. So what does our data have? Right? First of all, how does Minnesota do their criminal sentencing? So they have these grids for different crime categories. So other crimes are in categories like drug crimes, person crimes, property crimes. Right? And the category has these grids. And in these grids, you have the different specific crimes, their severity level. And then for each defendant, you have an index that measures essentially their criminal history, their priors. Right? And so based on the crime, its severity, and the priors, there is a presumptive sentence in months. And in our data set, that's the variable time. There's the minimum time. So Minnesota, like many states, has a presumptive sentence and then bounds, a minimum time and a maximum time. And the maximum time's a little closer. It's not symmetric. The maximum time's a little closer to the presumptive sentence than the minimum time is. And then the actual sentence is also in our data set, and that's the variable confined. And all of these are measured in months. So in a sense, these are the variables in our data set that we're going to use to construct response variables. And there is a bunch of explanatory variables. So I've kind of grouped them in some of the, in a few categories, right? So from the grid itself, there's of course the crime, which is a coded variable, the severity, which is also coded, and priors, which is this index that Minnesota produces. And I'm not quite sure how they do it, but I do know that it's an increasing function of how many priors you have. But they also take into account what your priors were and what their severity was. So it's a little more subtle. Another category this is the category we're very interested in, especially race, of explanatory variables or demographics. There's race, there's gender, ethnicity, age and of course some of these, like age is separated by age when you were committed, when the crime was committed, age when you were sentenced, things like that. And they also have a binary variable about whether the defendant was an adult or a juvenile. There's also what I call space-time coordinates, which is essentially kind of like where you are and who you're with. So there's data concerning the county, the specific court district you're in, I should say court district. That says data, I should say date and year and judge. So I included the judge in this category, but it's essentially the context in which your case was tried, kind of the physical and temporal context. One of the things that we're interested in looking at is rural versus urban. And finally, there are a bunch of aggravating and mitigating factors. So aggravating factors are factors that suggest to the judge that they should increase the sentence, and mitigating factors are the opposite. So some examples: an aggravating factor might be the presence of a deadly weapon. So burglary with a deadly weapon. The fact that you had a deadly weapon would be an aggravating factor in your sentence. Whereas a mitigating example might be if you were convicted of an attempted crime as opposed to the crime itself. So we call those inchoate crimes. And I spelled that wrong, but so it goes. I'll move on quickly. So what's in our data set? So I mentioned all the variables. We have, I believe, it's every sentence handed down for every count from 2001 to 2019, which contains nearly 300,000 observations, and we have 80 different explanatory variables. So that I've roughly grouped into those categories. So it's a very big, very complicated data set. It's fairly complete. It needs some cleaning, right? We found that when we first started looking at it. Lori Lendu, she hasn't been working with us for a while, but she started out with us and she noticed, for example, some judges' names were spelled a little bit differently here and there. So we haven't done the cleaning work yet, but that's on our agenda. So what are we seeing from the data? So the first thing we just want to acknowledge that makes this difficult is what we call the policing effect. The policing effect is the fact that some populations are more policed, are policed heavier than other populations. So this graph, don't take this graph to the bank. It's not very precise, but it illustrates what we're talking about. So you can see the blue are the percent of convictions in our data set. The orange is the percentage of the population. And the reason you don't want to rely too much on this for precision is because the blues from the conviction, the blue bars are from convictions between 2001 and 2019. The orange is the 2020 census, right? So the times don't quite match up. And we actually don't have the demographic data for every year, just every 10 years. So, we can make some assumptions and build a model there. But the point really we want to make is that tied up in all of the things that we're looking at is the fact that populations of color. In this case, if we trusted this data, it'd be Black and American Indian. That's how they call our natives, and the data is American Indian. Not the best, but anyhow, are over-policed and whites are under-policed. So that's a complicating factor. At some point, we're going to want to control for that factor, which means we're going to have to make what you're seeing here a little more precise. So with that bracket, and that's a highly non-trivial bracket, what are we seeing in the data? So this is just some data exploration that we've started with. And we're not, and I will tell you, we're not seeing huge differences, right, in the data. It doesn't mean they're not there, it's just we're not looking necessarily in all the right places. So what we have here, if we're just breaking down all of the prison sentences by race in the state. Now, there were a lot of outliers, so I've kind of put this into 3 different scales here. So if we look at this scale, these are more typical sentences ranging from 0 to 60 months. If you look at medians, Black's a little higher than some of the others, than white. Hispanic looks a little similar to white, as does Asian, and Native American or First Nations are a tick higher. And then in terms of variability, the other category is fairly tight, although I will tell you it's a fairly small category. But certainly for white and Black sentences, there seems to be quite a bit more under the median than over the median. So those are, I would say, 0. Oops, I'm looking at the wrong chart. Right? With the same story here. These are prison sentences between 0 and 60 months. So then I broke the outliers into 2 categories, right? Low outliers, those are sentences between 60 and about 180 months. So here, the medians all kind of line up. And we see in most of the categories, a higher proportion of sentences above the median. So a different skew. And then we can go to the higher outliers. So these are sentences running anywhere from 180 months and up to the highest sentence. And here we're seeing a lot of variation in the medians. Asians have higher medians. Hispanics and whites seem that category has the lowest. And for, I'd say, Asian, if you look at this, Asian and white sentences, it's roughly symmetric. White's a little bit, has a little bit more on the high end. Whereas for Hispanic, there's a lot more on the high end. So anyhow, those are some things, but notice there's nothing in any of these graphs that's really screaming out. But also these are aggregated over everything. Literally, we are just looking at race and sentencing, right? So there's a lot of factors underneath here. All those explanatory variables are not present in this graph. So let's look at something a little bit different. So in the next set of graphs, we zeroed in specifically on drug crimes. And the reason for that, the inspiration for that, has to do with the role of the war on drugs and the impact that has had on communities of color. In this case, what we looked at, instead of just the distribution of sentences, we looked at the distribution of the differences between the actual and presumptive sentences. And actually, each of these, they're skewed a little bit so that there are far more sentences being handed down below the presumptive sentence than above. And that's the case with all of these. And it's hard to see any real difference in kind of the shapes or the skew. We'd have to look a little bit closer. Similar, we have similar conclusions where we look at sentences, just the distribution of sentences that are exceeding the presumptive sentence, except if you look at Hispanic, there's a slight shift to the right of the peak. So there may be a little something there. And finally, now remember I mentioned there was a range, right? There's your presumptive, there's your minimum, and there's your maximum. So these are sentences exceeding the maximum. And in this story, these distributions look relatively similar. Now, of course, if we change our binning and stuff like that, we could find more stories. Right? But there's also, as I mentioned, a lot of other explanatory variables. So here's some other visualizations we did, we just broke these sentences down by race and by offense type. And so if we look at some for drug crimes, for example, these are Hispanic. This is Hispanic, actually. There's a little bit more variation than among some of the others. And, in person crimes, for example, this other category seems to have a fairly wide variation, but we're not seeing that much difference, except maybe down here in weapon. But even in weapon, almost all the sentences are beneath the median, interestingly enough. So, so our initial exploration suggests if there are differences, they're not widely obvious, right? That's not what, now, some others have looked at some of this, they've run some chi-square tests and found some significant differences, but they haven't looked at effect size. And the reason I would worry about that is because with 300,000 observations, I feel like this tiniest difference could be statistically significant. So effect size is what we really want to look at, but we want to see more generally, what are the factors that are impacting sentencing and what role does race play in that? So what we really want to do is some sort of regression. So now that we've kind of looked at the data, we're not seeing a whole lot that's jumping out at us, at least not with some of the things that we've looked at. Nothing feels terribly obvious, but we're not convinced that there aren't, issues to find. Right? So what are we going to do now? Well, now we really, like I said, to make things a little bit more concrete, we'd like to take a look at some kind of regression analysis. So the first thing we need to do is reduce our dimensionality. We need to find some way of reducing the number of explanatory variables we regress against. And so here's kind of the challenge. So as we've come to understand, principal component analysis is a typical way you might do this, right? However, a lot of our explanatories are categorical, and principal component analysis doesn't work for categorical variables, as I understand it. So instead, what we're looking into, and we're just starting to look into this, is to make some sense of multi-factor analysis, which I think is for the same purpose, but does things a little bit differently. But we're trying to figure out kind of what that means and how to run it. So just like some of the other talks we've heard today, we are learning a lot about data science by going through this project. And in a way, there's a professional development element to it for us, in addition to the importance and value of the results that we may obtain. Other things we've talked about is having some short sessions with visitors to talk us through some different methodologies and different approaches, so we can try that. We would like to sit down with the folks who did the federal JUSTFAIR project, talk about what they did. I'm also very curious about topological data analysis, because a lot of times you can take things that are really close and kick out some kind of something that's indexed discretely, like the homology, right? And you can start a small difference. You can actually detect whether or not there's a difference there. There's a lot of things, a lot of places where we need to go. So we're kind of just getting started on this project. But we're already learning a lot, and we're looking forward to where it goes in the future. And we're grateful for QSIDE to provide the support and inspiration for the work that we're doing.